assessing justice, cultural factors. Yes, that's definitely also a gender-related barrier. I will give you just, yes, it's really hard to provide proof. Yes, it's also low levels of prosecution. That's also an important point. So I'm not sure whether there are further comments, but yes, I think it's like patriarchal-based system, cultural exclusion from visibility and voice. I think these are really interesting points, and I think most of them will be also covered in our presentation. So I would like, first of all, to thank all of you for your active participation. So, and now I would like to give the words to Professor Hodan Isse, who will be moderating the today's session. So she's one of the initiators of this webinar and a close friend to Tangaza University College. She's also the Professor of Emeritus of the School of Management at the University of Buffalo, as well as the founder of the Transitional Justice and Trauma Healing Center in the Puntland University, State University. So the floor is yours, Professor Hodan Isse.
You can hear me now, Susan?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I am very delighted to be part of this Zoom meeting regarding what are the gender-related concerning the women as agents of change and the trauma they, in fact, deal with. There are all sorts of trauma, and just because of due to lack of transitional justice in most African, particularly East Africa and the Horn of Africa. Many things related to loss of life and property, violent death of a parent, especially women, the FGM, female genital mutilation, clan-based violence, which clans don't consider women. They're part of any clan, or they don't pay blood money, and therefore have no voice. Gender-based violence such as rape, domestic violence, all sorts of problems related to the things that are inflicted on women based on their gender, and the ensuing trauma they have to actually withstand. In addition to that, most African countries, we know, we deal with extreme poverty and starvation, internal displacement, refugees, forced eviction due to war. All these things cause massive trauma, particularly the ones who deal with the brunt of war are women. What we're doing in this seminar or webinar is to understand the trauma-related issues and also to kind of get deeper into it. I will introduce our first speaker, but in the meantime, what I would like to do is to understand trauma as it relates to especially man-made trauma and how women can be the agent of change. Not only they are the who bear the brunt of trauma, but also they could be the ones who can actually come up with solutions because it impacts their life in a very, very dear way. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. I will assume Cyrus Mawiu, sorry, who is representing Dr. Banu Magisa. If I can say a few things about Cyrus, she holds LLB degree from the University of Nairobi, a postdoctorate or postgraduate diploma in law from Kenya School of Law, and a Master of Arts degree in Development and Governance from University of Duisburg, Eastern Germany. He is a legal practitioner with diverse experience in human rights and social justice sector. Has worked extensively with national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, and the public in receipt and processing of human rights complaints, including the provision of appropriate legal advice, investigations, research, and advocacy. Master Mawiu, I will apologize for mispronouncing the name, has been involved in constitutional and human rights litigations, having handled strategic public interest litigation cases. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Cyrus. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Professor, for that very kind and very elaborate introduction. I bring you greetings from our Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Bernard Mogesa, who could unfortunately not join us today due to exigencies of work. I am very grateful to the management of Tangaza University College for organizing this very critical webinar to discuss a matter that is of broad public importance. And I'm equally grateful for them for extending the invite to the KNCHR through our CEO, Dr. Mogesa, to say a few words. My name, has been already pointed out, is Cyrus Mawel. I am a Deputy Director at the National Commission on Human Rights. By way of introduction, please permit me to say a few things about the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and then I will proceed to discuss the subject of today by sharing a few thoughts from our perspective as a national human rights institution. So about the KNCHR, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, or the KNCHR, briefly, is one of the independent mechanisms under the Kenyan Constitution. It's established under Article 59 of the Constitution, which is at the tail end of our Bill of Rights in Chapter 4, which has been hailed as a very progressive provision the world over, in that it secures and protects a number of rights for us as Kenyans and also for people in Kenya. The KNCHR has two very broad mandates, very briefly. One is to protect human rights in Kenya by acting as a watchdog to the government in the area and matters of human rights. And then it's got also a promotional mandate where it's mandated to move the country towards a country that respects human rights and a society where human rights are enjoyed by all persons. To fulfill this mandate, it discharges it through a number of functions or activities that include the receiving and processing of complaints on various allegations of human rights, creating public awareness on matters human rights, and also monitoring the state fulfillment of its obligations and its national, regional, and international human rights obligations. Permit me to proceed to the subject of the day. And when participants were giving their thoughts, it was interesting to hear the different perspectives and what they have in mind. And I will try as much as possible in my presentation to tie this and at least touch on what we've done as a national human rights institution to facilitate or to support efforts towards transitional justice. By its very nature, transitional justice has taken a number of different processes. Traditionally, this used to happen at a time when different countries were in transition, and I guess that is why it acquired the name transitional justice. Basically from instances of maybe gross violence to peace, or from an authoritarian regime to a democratic society. And this process has had a number of sub-activities or a number of processes that cumulatively have been seen as contributing to achievement of transitional justice. And these include, among others, the establishment of truth commissions that are meant to document the issues, the violations that have happened, and basically to give a clear picture of the circumstances under which those gross human rights violations have happened, who was responsible for those violations. And this is very, very important in terms of charting the way forward, because when we are discussing transitional justice, it not only focuses on the past, but how can you know where you are going if you do not know where you are coming from? So transitional justice broadly borrows from that, in that to secure the future and to ensure sustainable peace and equality and an environment where people can enjoy their rights, it's important to look at the past, especially where we've had instances of gross human rights violations. And this takes me to the next process, which is basically provision of redress for the violations that are disclosed from that documentation process. And this borrows heavily from international law, where the principle has been stated very clearly that for every violation, there must be a remedy. So this necessitates investigations that are conducted to ensure that what happened is well documented and the victims are provided not only with the platform that can provide justice in terms of the physical access to the forum of justice, but also a remedy for the violations that are disclosed to have happened. Again, people often discuss the question of reforms, be they institutional reforms, and this is basically to address the root causes of the issues that facilitated the violations and to basically ensure this does not happen again. And these reforms could take the nature or the form of legal reforms, where you deal with changes in the law, like it happened in Kenya, where there were a number of reforms flowing from the constitution and aligning different provisions of our national legislation to conform to the new constitutional dispensation. It could also focus on institutional reforms to basically ensure that the institutions are more responsive to the needs of the people, and such issues or such violations that are sought to be addressed do not reoccur. Again, there is a question of criminal justice. How do you ensure perpetrator accountability, and how do you bring those who are responsible for the gross human rights violations to account, and basically ensure the environment that facilitated impunity is addressed and it does not occur. The list is not exhaustive, or there are many other forms that transitional justice takes. There's a question of reparations, where you deal with basically trying as much as possible, where it is practical, to return the victims to the state they were before the violations occurred. There is also at times the question of memorials, where you erect a memorial in memory and in commemoration of the victims, and it serves as a site of remembrance for the issues that are being addressed. Why is it important to adopt a gender lens when we are dealing with transitional justice? My very honest take on this is that, number one, it's very essential to ensuring justice for all, and also looking at it from a gender perspective, because there are those violations that could have occurred because of the gender or the sex of the victims. And there are those that, in terms of impact, the impact is not equal to both. Again, why this is important, it's because men and women are affected differently by the past injustices. So it is very, very important to document the impact of the violations on each. And there are some crimes or some human rights violations that may not be so visible. And unless we take a gender lens to transitional justice, some of these could be lost in the process. Again, it facilitates both men and women to chart a way forward and give recommendations that are sensitive to their different dynamics, and also ensures that they contribute to the investigations, which is very, very important for all, and the contribution towards sustainable peace and addressing the past is equally something of concern to both men and women. So it is very, very important to ensure that they are factored in our transitional justice mechanisms. So I will proceed to just briefly highlight how we can make this possible, how we can adopt a gender perspective to transitional justice. One of the things that we can do this is to ensure the participation of both, and this we can do through very wide consultation. We ensure that the process that we adopt for the transitional justice, whether it's the Truth Commission, whether it's the reforms that we have in mind, whether it is the reparations, whatever process that we adopt, we ensure the participation of everyone, and especially the most vulnerable in the society. It is very, very important to ensure that there is awareness that is created on the existence of these mechanisms, what they seek to achieve, and how we can meaningfully participate, whether as men or as women. Something else that can be done is to ensure that we have targeted consultation by the transitional justice mechanisms with both men and women, amongst other vulnerable groups within the community. And this is basically an acknowledgement and appreciation of the simple fact that everyone, whether male or female, has a very critical and useful input, and they can shape the process as well as the outcome, and ensure that the outcome reflects especially the root causes, the harm they suffered, and what is proposed in terms of addressing the problem is gender sensitive, is alive to their particular needs, and in a way contributes to addressing their peculiar or their specific issues of concern. Again, we can achieve this by ensuring there's balanced input of both men and women in the process, and this we can seek out their participation in the process. And to ensure this, we can partner with organizations that represent their different interests, and these we can request them to mobilize their attendance and participation in both the process as well as monitoring the outcome of that process. Again, when it comes to logistical and other gender-specific concerns, this is something that we can actively look out for and ensure that we are very sensitive, especially in the processes that we adopt. I have in mind, for instance, the process adopted by the South African Truth Commission, where they had different and special sessions for women, and they also had gender experts, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually had a chapter on women and participated in a lot of research on gender specific issues. So what is it that we've done as an NHRI to support transitional justice in the country? But before then, maybe I can highlight a few things that touch on transitional justice in Kenya and the efforts that have been put in place to ensure transitional justice. A lot has happened. Maybe it's not satisfactory yet. Maybe we've not fully achieved what we wanted to, but we've had transitional justice related processes. Kenya took the route of Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission that had public hearings, documented and recorded about, I think there were 17 They received 1,700 memoranda from different actors. They also recorded statements from different communities and also from individuals who are affected in one way or another by the past. And in that process, a Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission led the entire exercise. Now, part of the challenges that we've had as a country is getting the report to be discussed in Parliament for adoption as the official documentation of the injuries suffered by the victims, as well as the gross human rights violations. And these could pave way for reparations in line with the proposals in that Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. Again, the question of reparations and the discussion around the creation of a reparation fund, the setting aside of funds for that to operationalize that activity, basically the provision of reparations to different victims. And I would blame this on a perceived or apparent lack of political will in having these reports discussed and formally adopted to pave the way forward in terms of operationalizing the recommendations, the reparation fund, and also the specific recommendations of the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. We also had a new constitution, which could be seen in the transitional justice perspective, that has provided for equality and non-discrimination and is providing in a very express manner the inclusion of especially women in the daily activities of our lives, including participation in the political life and political leadership of this country. Again, we've had a number of cases that have been litigated that seek to ensure the gender equality that is provided for and secured and guaranteed in the Constitution is given a practical effect. Unfortunately, when it comes to our political leadership, we still have not managed to achieve the 1/3 gender requirement of the Constitution, despite the litigation that I've just highlighted, despite even a very express advisory from the highest of our courts, being the Supreme Court of Kenya, and despite a very express advisory from the former Chief Justice just before leaving office to the President to consider dissolution of Parliament for its failure to pass a law that requires not more than 1/3 of the leadership to be of the same gender. Winding up, there is a lot that can be done to ensure gendered lens towards transitional justice. We may not be where we want to be, but I believe there's a lot that we can do, both as an NHRI, as a community, and also in collaboration with both the academia and the civil society actors to continue the advocacy, especially for adoption of the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, and to ensure that as a country, we get to deal with the transitional justice issues that were identified, because again, unless we deal with the past, oftentimes it becomes quite hard to forge ahead in a very sustainable manner, as the ghost of the past, as it's referred to oftentimes, comes back to haunt us each and every time we take a step towards redressing the past and consolidating our democracy as a country. I wish to stop at that. If the opportunity presents itself, I will be happy to provide any clarification as and may be necessary. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cyrus. I really appreciate your presentation regarding you put a little bit more weight on transitional justice and trauma. I do understand, and you specifically spoke relating to the institutions that has been established like the Truth Commission in the in Kenya. My question is, as you know, there are challenges facing African women, particularly East African women and the women from the Horn in today. As you know, the customary law and the proliferation of tribe, clan, whatever you call it, assembly that assume as a governing body, that has actually, I do believe that has also diminished the role of women and further reduce their place in the society. And also the way allocation of human capital as it relates to political, social, and economic, these inequities have even underutilized talented women. And all these things, whether it's political inequity, social inequity, health inequity, all these things where women feel like, where we feel women are underrepresented, has caused a lot of trauma. Not only trauma from domestic violence or rape or female genital mutilation, but also having their own country, they have to pick for political, economic, social representation. Yes, transitional justice, all these issues has originated from transitional justice, but by specific things we are really looking today was to look at what has been done or have been done regarding the issue of trauma. And if I may sort of get into it so my question will be a little bit more elaborate. These days, people's attitude toward women is conceptually shaped by mutually three reinforcing factors: the patriarchal society, the customary law, the misinterpretation of religion, be Christian or Islam or any other African religion, which actually I believe that even women perform worse in any of these. The value of women are diminished. There are no legal institutions to support women. There might be some, especially particularly with countries that are going through civil war. Some went back to the traditional system, which was already, while it might have some merits, is outdated and unbiased with gender issues. There was no place for women to express their dismay with the clan system. They don't pay blood compensation or blood money, therefore are not, as you know, that there is also, in addition to the violence, domestic violence, FGM, there are proliferation of single woman motherhood. As you know, in Kenya, in Somalia, in Uganda, and everywhere, these things are, so the whole family institution has failed. And mostly those who bear the brunt of being the female-headed households, that was something that you will think it was in the US, but now it's in Africa. And that causes trauma. Or it originates from some sort of economic, social, or political injustice, but that has actually caused trauma and diminished the value of women. Even in diaspora, you can just find those. So whether it's poverty, inequality, the political, economic injustice, polarization, all sorts of, even if girl is raped, for example, the media is hesitant to talk about it. Media don't want to suffer repercussions, so they cover these things. So I would like you to a little bit touch on that, women's lack of political voice and political cloth. That would be really something I would like to, and then maybe at the end, maybe you can either, based on what you know is specific to Kenya or in general to East Africa, if there are any solutions. Yes, I really appreciate the way you spoke about the transitional justice and how we are progressing by establishing certain commissions. But in terms of trauma and the issue related to women, can you kind of speak to that trauma a little bit and how it's really causing a lot of issues, not only to women, but the youth and also young children? I will appreciate if you take on that topic for 5-10 minutes and elaborate a little bit further a bit of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that question. I would start by making a very general observation. I agree with you that we are in a very patriarchal society where the place of the woman has not been fully appreciated both by the community, and this has caused a lot of challenges and a lot of trauma to especially our sisters and our aunties and our mothers in different sectors of the society, be it in the political, in the social economic, as you've correctly observed. I would also agree with you that one of the challenges is actually the culture that is prevalent in most of our African communities that does not fully appreciate the role and the place of the woman in contributing to change in the society. So all these inequalities cumulatively and jointly contribute to a lot of trauma. They contribute to a lot of otherwise negative perceptions about the place of the woman. And again, our stereotypical thinking and expectations informed by the society that we've been brought in, the expectation is that women oftentimes are not, they are seen as passive participants in most of these processes, especially the political processes. And that has, in a way, contributed and can be blamed for the low numbers when it comes to the participation of women in our different political and other leadership positions. Now, what can be done to address this and what has been done to address this? I will just highlight a few things in terms of what has been done and what I think could be done to ensure that we have a sort of more level playing field for everyone in the country, irrespective of their gender and their sex. One of the things, and I will touch on the issues that you've already identified, the question of culture, the question of customs, the question of injustice, and yes, those traditional justice mechanisms that I will tie to culture. One of the things is that we need constant public education, constant awareness to everyone, especially the leaders in the society, for them to appreciate that times have changed. Especially for us in Kenya, we are operating under a different constitutional dispensation that promotes culture, but only to the extent that it does not lead to a violation of human rights, and the right to equality and non-discrimination is one of the rights that are secured and protected under the Constitution. So a lot of public education just to ensure that as many as can be reached get to appreciate that it is time to respect and provide equal opportunities to our sisters, to our aunties, to our mothers, and basically to our women in the society. Now, touching on injustice, especially in some of the societies, you would find that most of the women and most of the community members, especially in the traditional setup, rarely approach the formal justice mechanisms as and when they have disputes. Most of them go to the traditional justice mechanisms and the traditional justice actors. Unfortunately, in most of these communities, the leadership of these traditional justice mechanisms is by men. Undoubtedly, and it's obvious that these mechanisms handle disputes that touch on women issues. So part of the things and what we've done as an institution ourselves is to encourage them to adopt what we call the human rights-based approach, and to ensure that even in their leadership, as and when they sit down to handle those disputes, women get to participate and participate meaningfully. So again, the question of inclusion and participation in all affairs of the society and the community that we are in. To ensure this is done, again, we have to encourage even the women themselves to take active roles in these positions, in these leadership positions, and also in these justice mechanisms, and ensure that women issues, as and when they are brought before these justice mechanisms, are handled in a manner that is gender sensitive and that is alive to the specific concerns and the specific plight of the girl child and women in general. We've had a lot of discussion as a country on the question of affirmative action. What is it that can be done to level the playing field to ensure that women do not suffer double and in other times extra marginalization when it comes to leadership, when it comes to the realization of their social economic rights amongst many other rights. On some of the cultural practices that you've identified, such as female genital mutilation, fortunately for us in Kenya, this is already declared to be a criminal offense, and it is not something that is legally supported. It's been legalized, it's been legislated against, and anyone who's found to be doing it, encouraging it, or in any way supporting its practice can and should be prosecuted. Just to digress a bit and to just provide a context, we had a very interesting case in the country where that law was challenged against the right to practice culture, and the Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Division of the High Court was very clear that this is a practice that is outlawed and remains unconstitutional in the country. So again, the question of creating public awareness, can we have alternative rites of passage that are not harmful, especially to the women in the communities that we live in? I think I would stop at that, but I would be very happy if the opportunity presents itself to provide further clarification and take a couple of other questions, if any. Professor?
Thank you so much for the clarification. I think soon we will be going to the question, but just one more question, just to ask, we expected, you talked about legal reforms, and I think you touched on that, but in terms of issues related to the traumatizing experience for women, especially due to lack of justice, whether it's their body or whether it's the behavior that society, about be cultural or even misunderstood or misrepresentation of religion, which we know most religions liberate women. I can speak on Islam. Women were buried alive before the Prophet Muhammad came to being, but there are cultures now. I will give an example. Maybe you can speak to it in terms of Kenyan things, but what I notice is, okay, we understand the cultural law, we understand the legal law, but there are multiplicity of multiple layers of, like, the traditional law. Say, for example, a girl is raped in some countries, and then their clan chiefs will handle it. All the compensation will go to them, while the women are already stigmatized and also suffer huge trauma from it. So is there any laws that, I know you spoke about the FGM, and I'm very grateful to the fact that it's a criminal offense in Kenya, but there are all sorts of traumatizing experience in terms of domestic violence, all sorts of things. Can you by any chance speak to it? Because we're trying to sort of, because eventually our goal for this whole webinar is to create a center for research that are homegrown, not something you download from the US or from Canada, but issues that are pertinent in Africa, in Kenya, in Somalia, in Nigeria, anywhere, in Sudan, that we can actually solve our own problems without exporting it from or importing it from other countries. So it's a homegrown, locally accessible, but also people can learn from it. So it's, you could speak on the other issues, traumatizing issues related to gender, I'll appreciate it. And then that will be my sort of going back to what you said and analyzing it and coming back, especially when you talk about legal reform Can you speak about the domestic violence and other related issues, and even the family is the unit. Family, especially the father, the children. You see, even in Kenya, there are a lot of women who are single mothers and who don't get any support from the fathers. Is there any system or any law that can make men responsible so women are not traumatized? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that follow-up question, Professor. I will attempt to answer it. And one of the things that I would like to also applaud this forum for is the quest and the desire to look for homegrown solutions. I believe this is the way to go, because the issue that we are dealing with is about the lived realities by women in the different environments that we operate under. So I'm very, very grateful that that is the approach it's taking. And I have tried the best I could to ensure that even the examples I provide are informed by the realities in the country. So moving to answer the question that you've raised, there are very, very many causes of trauma, and it's not an experience that we would wish that it persists. Our prayer and our hope is that it can get contained and people find peace and meaningful peace, which is sustainable for their existence. So moving on and touching on especially some of the specific questions that you raised, the question of religion, I think, fortunately for us in Kenya, the law treats all the religions equally. And again, being the Constitution being very, very supreme, the supreme law, no one is allowed to use any excuse, be it religion, be it cultural, be it tradition, be it their custom, to violate another or to cause trauma to another in the pretext of pursuing any other goal. Again, the question of stigmatization, it is very real. We are in a community where certain things are perceived from a very stereotypical angle. Unfortunately, it's the reality. The best we can do is to constantly urge these people, constantly educate them in the hope that we can get them to a level where they do not stigmatize one because of their sex. To address the question of domestic violence, the question of child support, the question of trauma relating to family disputes and lack of child support, especially for single mothers who are abandoned by their spouses. Allow me to move back and start with domestic violence. It is a common concern, especially looking at the media reports. It went a level higher with the start of the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. There are many factors that are attributable to that, but in terms of addressing it, the law has come to the aid of victims of domestic violence. They could be women, they could be men. So the law doesn't differentiate in terms of who causes that. A perpetrator is seen as such, whether it's a woman who turns against the husband or the husband who turns against his spouse and perpetrates domestic violence. The law does not distinguish against any of them. Both will be treated as criminal suspects and prosecutions will be pursued. Again, there is also the question of family. We are in a setup where there have been efforts to ensure equality of both partners in a marriage, where the husband and the wife have equal rights both at the start, during the continuance of the marriage, and even at the termination of the marriage union. And that is provided for in law. And in actual fact, we have seen cases where even women file for divorce when the situation becomes quite untenable, again, also due to the trauma arising from those experiences, and also also as a consequence of, among other factors, domestic violence. Again, tying that to domestic violence, it's actually one of the grounds that are provided for as a ground for petitioning for divorce. Basically to severe or say, bring to an end the marriage union, as opposed to causing more trauma on one of the parties when they are being subjected to this cruelty. I would agree that oftentimes women are left to fend for their children, but there are remedies that are provided for as and when such occurrences happen. And the law provides for children in a very express and very specific manner that children should be provided for, and parental responsibility is not in any way related to the relationship between the parents of the child. So whether or not they are married, the law obligates them to provide for their children in an equal manner. So the mother and the father, irrespective of whether or not they are in a marriage union. Because not everyone can easily access the formal justice mechanisms, the state has created a children's department where in every county, Kenya is divided into 47 counties, a devolved system of governance where services are decentralized from the central government, and there are efforts to bring them as close as possible to the common citizen. So the efforts that have been taken is to ensure that there is at least a child officer in every county who can listen to child-related matters, including failure or non-maintenance of a child, where one of the parties basically neglects their child, which is equally a criminal offense for which one can be prosecuted for. So that is one of the avenues that have been provided for to ensure that people do not have to carry the burden, especially in cases where it's a question of neglect. That spouse or that parent is available and they are just simply refusing to take care of and provide for their child. Again, related to domestic violence, there have been efforts to ensure that we have gender desks that are manned by officers at police stations. And this is basically to ensure that there is gender sensitivity in reporting of some of these gender specific or some of the violations that have as an aspect of gender in them. And this has, in the recent past, led to increased reporting, especially by women on matters gender violence. Again, in most of the public hospitals, and this touches on access to healthcare, we have gender violence recovery centers, GVRCs, in most of the hospitals, where especially victims of gender and sexual-based violence are given special treatment, and even the documentation for purposes of ensuring accountability from a criminal justice perspective is well documented, and some of those officers who man the gender violence, the GVRCs, as we call them, are actually able to properly document and as and when needed, provide that evidence to the courts. Again, there have been efforts to sensitize, especially the public, on preservation of evidence when it comes to sexual and other domestic related violence cases for purposes of ensuring that the perpetrators do not get away with some of these very heinous crimes and gross human rights violations. I think that is what I can identify for now. There are quite a number of examples on what has been done and efforts towards addressing and making it more friendly to report instances of gender-based violence and domestic violence, especially at our local police stations, for action to be taken from there. Again, we also have a Sexual Offences Act that provides for different crimes, including rape, defilement, where the crime touches on minors below the age of 18 years, which are again very traumatic experiences, especially for women and even men in cases where people fall victim to those crimes. We are still, as a country, having discussions, and there are efforts to review the act to basically assess how effective it's been in terms of implementation and what can be done to ensure that it's implemented in a more effective manner that protects and ensures especially our children, our boys and girls are protected from sexual and other exploitation. Professor, allow me to stop at that, but I'm willing to take more questions and provide further clarification.
Thank you very much. I think I really appreciate you clarifying questions I have bombarded you with, but I would like to pass the microphone, I would say in a live to Susan, who will be taking it from here for questions and answers. Susan?
Yes, so I just would also like to give the floor to the audience who maybe have questions. So there's one question in terms of how much are people aware of the provisions in the law? Is there any civic education programs concerning these matters? So Mr. Maweu, maybe you can just refer to that question first, and after that we will just answer the question step by step.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that very important question. My general observation is that there are low levels of awareness on the legal provisions broadly, and also on matters human rights. People are not fully aware, or it's not to the level that we would be happy with, and a level that we can celebrate both as a community, as a country, and also as a national human rights institution. So I would say there are low levels of awareness. Of course, there are civic engagement programs. There are civic awareness programs. We have tried our bit, and we also partner with different, especially different partners who have direct contact with the communities. Unfortunately, when COVID came, it presented a number of challenges because I'm sure we are all aware of the containment measures. Part of them is the limiting of gatherings, the requirement that we maintain social distance. So this, in a way, also adversely affected our civic awareness programs. And we just try to the extent possible to ensure that as many as we can reach out to get to understand their rights. And we also tie this with general legal awareness, especially where specific issues have been identified as of concern to a particular community. For instance, if we go to a certain area and domestic violence or family-related issues such as maintenance, child support, divorce, succession, and inheritance are a common problem, we try as much as possible to create awareness both on the legal provisions and the different redress mechanisms available in the event of a violation. Susan?
Thank you very much for answering that question. I think particularly you also mentioned it in terms of COVID. This makes it on the one hand, quite difficult to also keep up with civic education programs, but on the other hand, there's also like an increase of gender and sexual based gender and sexual violence. So I think this is a problem on both sides. So thank you very much for also highlighting the importance of this question. Yes, so I think a second question would be, in consideration of the current high rise in school-aged girls in both primary and secondary levels, what would you recommend as a remedial approach in managing the trauma experienced by the young victims? And what role can the Kenya National Human Rights Commission play to counter this?
Thank you for that question. This has been a very, very serious and disturbing concern in the country. Again, if you look at it from a human rights perspective, because this is basically our niche or our area of expertise and experience as a national human rights institution, it brings with it some very serious ramifications on matters human rights. One is it compromises the right to health for these, especially the young girls. It also compromises their right to education, in that oftentimes their learning is disrupted, and there's a lot that happens that is of specific harm, especially to the girl child who is affected by this particular problem. So part of what I think and I believe should be done is to ensure there is constant guidance and counseling, especially at school level. Children spend about a third of their life, or yes, at that age, they spend a better fraction of their time in school. Some are in boarding schools, some are in day schools, but they spend most of the time in school. So this is a shared responsibility in my very humble view. It cannot be that it is only the school that is supposed to take the responsibility and ensure that we get to address this. It is our problem as a community, as a society. We have a role to play to constantly ensure, to the extent possible, that we minimize this, and also in the unlikely event where it happens, we have to support. There should be social safety nets and support mechanisms for the girl child in order to manage the trauma that is likely to be caused as a consequence of them finding themselves in that condition. And this we have to do, whether at community level, whether at religious level, where the church and other religious leaders would have a very critical role to play in supporting and ensuring that we uphold morality in what we do. Susan, I don't know if I've adequately answered.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important to highlight the shared responsibility of the society and also of the role of the church in upholding the safety net. So I think one question that has been raised as well is also in terms of corruption. So there was a comment in that it's also that it is important to have like bodies and policies that are in place. But then the functionality of them is a different story. So at times it's very difficult for the poor to follow up to the end to get justice. And on the other hand, you have issues of corruption and the perpetrators is set free without justice being rendered. So also when I just think about like amnesia laws and so on, maybe you can just clarify a little bit in this regard, and what are possible approaches to counter these issues?
Thank you for that question, Susan. If you allow me to just weigh in on the last question, just to add just one additional point. I am happy that at the moment, our public hospitals have a way of providing psychosocial support. It may not be to the extent that is adequate to cover the entire country, but at least it's a good starting point. So again, to address the question of trauma because of the past or the present in terms of what is happening that is causing the trauma, there is now an avenue for people to approach the public hospitals and get some of these services, psychosocial support services, at relatively subsidized and more affordable charges. On the question of corruption and justice, it's a very serious concern. I think it's a problem the world over, not only in Kenya. It's not a country unique problem. But I would say that justice of whatever nature, be it in the alternative justice system, be it in the formal justice mechanisms, justice is never a very cheap endeavor. It's an expensive exercise. It's got sacrifices. Sometimes the system do not function, but we can't sort of give up and let the system or the efforts go to waste. I am alive. I say this alive to the fact that at times people get a lot of dissatisfaction when they file cases with the respective institutions, and few years down the line, they see the perpetrators walk free. But then there are many factors that are responsible for this. Corruption could be one of them. It could also be our system of justice, especially now speaking specific to Kenya, our system of justice is the adversarial system of justice, where the judge or the magistrate is expected to be as impartial as they can be in listening to the evidence that is adduced and applying the law to the evidence that is adduced and rendering their opinion based purely on the law and the evidence that has been abused. Sorry, the evidence that has been produced. Now, sometimes the challenge is citizens give up. We report, but we don't follow up. As and when we are required to provide the evidence where it counts, that is now before the formal justice mechanisms, sometimes people chicken out, sometimes people do not follow through. And this in and of itself presents a number of challenges in that acquittals are likely to happen, not because the crime was not committed, but because the critical evidence that would have been adduced to handle and serve the justice of that particular case has not found its way to the specific tribunal that is handling the specific issue. So I would say that we continue with the efforts. We support to the extent possible the justice mechanisms. If we have critical pieces of information, one would rather approach the justice mechanism, and where there are threats, seek witness protection and the relevant institutions that are capable and are charged with protecting witnesses, because I am also alive to the fact that it's a dangerous affair at times, but that does not mean we give up on it altogether. You had asked about immunity. I'm not too sure I got it right, but for us, speaking for Kenya, there's no immunity for corruption-related crimes. Actually, the law specifically provides for economic crimes that are punishable, and there are specific courts that have been empowered to hear and determine matters that touch on economic crimes. Corruption is one of them. Susan?
Yes, thank you very much. So I think maybe in terms of the immunity, it was referred to Uganda. And also But maybe I just wanted to refer what you say, that some people also give up, which might be also either a reason or due to that they are stigmatized, or also when we just refer to trauma healing, it might be also the risk that people, or particularly women, get re-traumatized when they are confronted like with gender insensitive courts and something like, and how can we handle that? And also I think a big problem is as well that, for example, less fortunate people are still less able to access justice, and what can be done in this regard. And also, I just wanted to refer to I think some minutes ago, you also referred to traditional justice mechanisms, which are mostly male dominated. But I think the same applies to to transitional justice mechanism, and what can be done in general, because our focus area today is on gender. So what can be done to make the whole process more gender sensitive, also to avoid re-traumatization, for example, in terms of gender audits of law, or audits in terms of audits of capacities of the law enforcement and something like that. Maybe you can just refer to that.
Thank you for that very important question that broadly touches on access to justice. My take would be that even in matters of access to justice, we have to take a gender lens. We have to look and isolate the specific concerns that relate to gender. And one of them is, in terms of the substantive remedy, because it's also one of the questions when we discuss matters of access to justice, we look at the substantive remedy. What remedies are given from these justice mechanisms? The formal justice mechanisms are a bit easier to predict because you sort of know the possible outcomes when one files a case or when one seeks justice from these formal justice mechanisms. But we still have the other challenge that I earlier on spoken about on traditional justice mechanisms that are male-dominated, that apply culture, which is again informed by a very patriarchal society, and that inevitably continue to handle matters that touch on gender-specific issues and the rights of especially women. What is it that we can do? Number one, because it's also something that is quite evolving, and it's something that is very dynamic and is very community and also region sensitive and specific. One of the things that we can do is to have sessions, capacity building sessions with especially the justice actors, be they the traditional justice actors, be they for the formal justice actors. Again, as a society, we need to learn from our experiences, our lived realities, and from time to time, make changes where necessary to accommodate the realities of the day. If women are unable to access the formal justice mechanisms of the traditional justice mechanisms for one reason or another, then it's time to look specifically into that issue and ask ourselves, what are the root causes? Because unless we get to a point where we address that, the trauma will continue because the causal factors will not have been addressed and the problems will persist. So I would say that one of the things is to ensure the participation of women, especially in the traditional justice mechanisms. With the inclusion and participation, at least they will bring on board their experiences as women, and they, in so participating, would actually be more alive to their specific concerns and would ensure that the outcome of those processes is more gender sensitive, is more better and more remedial, as opposed to the possibility of giving orders that are capable of re-traumatizing these victims more. Again, continued engagement, especially with the formal justice mechanisms in terms of the remedies that they provide. Oftentimes, it's very easy to just look at it from a criminal justice perspective, as opposed to looking at it more broadly and looking at it beyond the crime that has been committed. What could be some of the factors that contribute to this? And what are some of the remedies that, if they were to be given, they would, in a more sustainable manner, provide a more substantive remedy, especially to women, to avoid the possibility of being re-traumatized and being in the same environment that causes them the challenges that they go through and the build-up trauma. Again, in terms of access to justice, the question of accessibility, access to that justice mechanism, that is still a problem, because oftentimes you find even the formal justice mechanisms are not very accessible, be it physical access or even economic access. Just to illustrate, and please indulge me for digressing a bit, if you look at some of the regions that have courts, the areas are so vast, it's not very easy to access a court for those who seek justice from the formal justice mechanisms. The infrastructure, the road infrastructure is not the most developed. So one has to walk kilometers and kilometers, and one has to incur more expenses to access that justice mechanism. If you look at this as against the historical marginalization of women, then it becomes slightly harder for them to access these justice mechanisms. So one would be violated, one would have a problem, but because of those challenges, they are unable to access that justice mechanism because of all those reasons, and this is a wake-up call for all of us to see what can be done. Even with the efforts in light of COVID, with the embracing and leveraging on technology to enhance access to justice, it's not everyone, especially in the traditional setup, who has access to internet, who has access to a smartphone, who has access to a computer that can facilitate them to access these formal justice mechanisms. So something is being done. As to how adequate, I am not too sure. That's a discussion we can have, but I'm very certain that a lot more needs to be done to ensure that people get access to justice, and access to justice becomes a practical reality for many of them. Again, take it way beyond access and the remedy that people are getting. The question of non-compliance, especially for those who seek justice from the formal justice mechanisms, it's something that traumatizes many victims of injustice. You spend resources, you challenge the issue that is of concern to that person, you get a favorable judgment, but it stays as just judgment. So again, we need to have a discussion on how best we can move from judgment on paper to justice on the ground, where people get to enjoy the fruits of their judgment. That is still a very serious challenge. It continues to traumatize, especially those who go through the entire spectrum in search of justice, and those who were, prior to seeking access to the justice mechanism, those who are already traumatized. So you've gone through an entire exercise that is traumatizing, and the outcome is not anything that you get to enjoy. That in itself causes more trauma. So I don't know if I've adequately answered, but I would, before stopping on that, just add that there is a need to ensure that our justice mechanisms are more gender sensitive. Just the way we took steps to ensure that we have children-friendly courts, even in the coloring in the court, the setup within the court, and the approach when it comes to handling child-related matters as and when they find their way in the formal justice mechanisms. It is also something that should be done and can be done to ensure that we have a more gender-sensitive approach to the dispensation of justice, especially in the formal justice mechanisms, to avoid a situation where there is a possibility of re-traumatizing the victims in their process, ironically, of seeking justice. Susan, I wish to stop at that.
Thank you very much. I think we have time to just answer one last question, and you already referred to it also when you just talk about access, and particularly those who are living in rural areas, for whom it's way harder to access justice, and also considering it from a psychological perspective, also that particularly in rural areas, also psychological and or psychosocial support is either non-existent or very expensive to the survivors, for example, of GBV or SGB. So what can be done to support those mostly women, and also in terms of that there's also cultural practices who are in place which refrains women and also minorities from accessing justice.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that question. For me, the starting point is seek them out. It is very easy to miss something that you are not actively looking out for. So as we conceptualize our interventions, as we program, as we design our projects, do we take a gender-specific angle to it? Do we specifically seek out especially women and the vulnerable? Allow me to mention something not so related, but about the SDGs. One of the core focus areas is access to justice. And the SDGs seek to ensure that no one is left behind. So even in our programming, even as we seek to achieve these global aspirations as a human race, are we really seeking out especially those who are left behind, far behind in the chain and in that transaction of moving forward towards achieving some of these aspirations that we have as humankind? The other thing that we need to do to ensure that especially women and the most vulnerable get to access justice is to ask ourselves what works for them. What justice mechanisms do they resort to? If they are not so comfortable, and if the formal justice mechanisms are a big challenge for them, how best can we make the traditional justice mechanisms more user-friendly to them and more substantive in terms of the remedies that they give to address especially the concerns of women? Permit me to highlight that in Kenya, we have an alternative justice systems policy. And this was born out of a desire to basically ensure enhanced access to justice for everyone in the country. And reading through, because I've had the benefit of reading the report of the task force that came up with it, the alternative justice systems policy, both the report, the baseline report, and the policy document, one gets to appreciate that the disputes that find their way in the formal justice mechanisms are a very tiny fraction of the disputes that occur. Most of the people file their disputes with the local alternative justice mechanisms that are close and that are more accessible to them. So to address this, I would say that it's time to address the cultural hindrances to some of these mechanisms, and more importantly, ensure the participation of women in these justice mechanisms. It is a process that is handling their issues. They should, as a matter of right, participate in these processes. Susan?
Sorry. Thank you very much also for highlighting the importance of local justice mechanisms, and also referring to the international level by highlighting the importance of trauma healing and transitional justice for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and leaving no one behind. I would like to thank you for this really fruitful input and answers you gave us, and I think we from Tangaza would be really interested to also work closer together with you. And now I would like to give the word to Beatrice Chu, who is the Dean of the School of Arts and Social Sciences, who will be closing the webinar.
I am very grateful to have this opportunity to thank especially our speaker, Mr. Cyrus Maweo, for a very enlightening input, highlighting the vital role of women in transitional justice, and even in the whole gender conversation in transitional justice and trauma healing. You have helped us so well, so coherently, so understandably to understand the status quo, the gaps that exist, the opportunities that are there for us to do something. And as Susan has said, Tangaza would be excited to continue this conversation with the Commission and to see how much, perhaps more, we could collaborate. So we really want to thank you very much, Mr. Maweo, for making yourself available and generously answering many questions and leaving the door open for others. We really, really appreciate. Unfortunately, our second speaker, Ms. Kagwiri Ambogori, was not able to join the call this evening, and Mr. Maweo has invested much value in the extra time that we found available. So again, we continue to be grateful. I would like to thank also very specially Professor Hodan Isse, who is the initiator of this series of webinar and a whole conversation on transitional justice and trauma healing in our country, for guiding the discussion today, especially today, and being a moderator and bringing in your expertise, Professor Hodan, into this webinar series at large. A particular vote of thanks to the organizers of the webinar, namely the Institute for Interreligious Dialogue and Islamic Studies, who are also financing the webinar series together with your partner, Agiomondo Civil Peace Service. I also want to thank the School of Arts and Social Sciences of Tangaza and Tangaza Marketing Department, who have also worked very hard to make this series of webinars meaningful. And I hope that our joint efforts in these webinars will bear fruit in engaging ourselves and others who join us to promote justice and healing for our people in this region of Africa and beyond. Last and certainly not least, I would really like to thank the participants. All of you for being engaged, actively participating, asking thought-provoking questions, and giving very helpful comments. Without your interest and participation, this webinar would not achieve their objectives. With you and because of you, we hope to constitute a critical mass of people in the populations who take, in the population of our country that take the trauma healing and transitional justice conversation seriously, bringing it into the mainstream and also bringing the benefits of public policy, attracting public resources to study and resolve the issues that arise, that are very many issues that are in these matters. And for this reason, we want to highly appreciate also your feedback, for which we request. There are several ways of giving us feedback. You can participate in a small 5-minute survey that is put in the slide in front of you, the QR code, using the QR code, or the link that is also provided. Kindly give us your feedback. It is very important and helpful to us. Otherwise, you are more than welcome also to write to us, to Evelyn, who is the administrator of the School of Arts and Social Sciences, and we will take your feedback on board as we go forward. Now to announce the next webinar. Our next webinar will focus on the role of youth. And this continent, we have a majority of youth population. And so it is a really important conversation. It will be our August webinar, the role of youth in transitional justice and trauma healing. It will be held on the 5th of August, and we are looking forward to see you all at that point. Once again, thank you all, and I wish you a wonderful evening. Back to you, Susan.
I think everything is said. So I would like to thank all of you and just wish you a wonderful evening. And then we will see us at our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you and good evening.